Howdy, partners. Welcome back to West America Facts. Today, we're saddling up to debunk some of the most absurd myths and misconceptions about the Old West. Y'all better hold on tight to your 10-gallon hats because you won't believe what we've got in store. Now, when you think of the Old West, you probably conjure up images of lawless outlaws running rampant, but that's just one of the many myths. The Old West, often romanticized in literature and popular culture, has given rise to numerous myths and misconceptions. While there's no shortage of fascinating and true stories from this era, here are 7 of the most ridiculous myths and misconceptions about the Old West. Gunfights were a daily occurrence. Let's debunk one of the biggest myths that's been plaguing our vision of the Old West for years. The idea that gunfights were a daily occurrence. You know, the kind you see in those action-packed movies with cowboys facing off on dusty streets at high noon. Well, here's the real deal, and it might just surprise you. While the Old West was undoubtedly a rough and tumble place with its fair share of conflicts and showdowns, the notion that gunfights were an everyday event is about as far from the truth as a tumbleweed in a snowstorm. These dramatic shootouts, the ones that have us on the edge of our seats in cinemas, were relatively rare compared to the action-packed portrayals we've grown accustomed to. In reality, folks back in those days were more interested in surviving and thriving than engaging in daily duels. The romanticized image of cowboys and outlaws constantly squaring off in dramatic fashion just doesn't square up with the historical records. You see, life on the frontier was tough enough as it was, with hard work, scarce resources, and the ever-present challenges of the wild and untamed wilderness. Don't get me wrong, there were conflicts and disagreements aplenty, but most folks in the Old West preferred peaceful resolutions over gunfights. They had families to feed, cattle to tend, and towns to build. Disputes were often settled in more mundane ways, like through negotiation or the legal system. It was more about building communities than staging daily shootouts. So the next time you find yourself picturing the Old West as an unending saga of high-stakes gunfights, remember that the real story is far more nuanced and fascinating. Life on the frontier was a complex tapestry of hard work, camaraderie, and the occasional showdown, but it certainly wasn't a daily shoot-'em-up spectacle. I can rest easy knowing that the true history of the Old West is every bit as captivating as the myths we've come to love. Everyone wore cowboy hats. Let's lasso another one of those Old West myths that's been riding high for way too long. The idea that everyone wore cowboy hats. Now, don't get me wrong, cowboy hats were as iconic as a cactus on the prairie, but let's mosey on over to the truth corral and set this record straight. You see, the Old West was a land as diverse as a tumbleweed's roll. While cowboy hats were as common as a campfire under the stars, they weren't the only show in town when it came to headwear. Folks back then weren't all about looking like they just stepped off a John Wayne movie set. Sure, those wide-brimmed hats were darn practical for shading from the relentless sun, and they could weather a sandstorm better than most. But let's not forget the variety in the Old West fashion parade. Many folks preferred other styles of headgear, from bowler hats to flat caps, and some folks, well, they just went bareheaded, taking the wind and sun on the chin. So, the next time you picture the Old West, remember it was as diverse as a herd of cattle on the open range. Cowboy hats were just one star in a big old western sky of fashion. And that's the truth, partner, as sure as the sun rises over the prairie. Saloon doors swung both ways. Those swinging saloon doors. You know the ones I'm talking about, right? They swing both ways, and cowboys dramatically burst through them like they're starring in a movie. Well, hold on to your Stetsons, because there's a little truth we need to wrangle here. Contrary to what you've seen in Hollywood, those saloon doors weren't designed to swing both ways for dramatic effect. Nope, they had a more practical purpose than that. You see, the Old West could be dusty, dry, and downright dirty, and those doors were a clever solution to a common problem: keeping the dust and grit out of the saloon. So, when a cowboy or a city slicker made their way into the saloon, those one-way swinging doors helped keep the elements at bay. They'd swing open when you pushed them, but they wouldn't swing back your way, helping to preserve a bit of that precious clean air inside. Of course, that doesn't mean you won't find a Hollywood-style saloon door somewhere out there in the Old West. But more often than not, these doors were practical tools, not just props for cinematic entrances. So the next time you see those swinging saloon doors in a movie, remember they were as much about keeping the dust out as they were about making a grand entrance. dueling was common. The idea that dueling was as common as tumbleweeds rolling across the prairie. You know the scene in those westerns, two folks glaring at each other, ready to draw and fire. Well, hold on to your hats, 'cause we're about to put this myth out to pasture. Contrary to the cinematic showdowns we've all seen, dueling was about as common as a snowstorm in the Arizona desert. In reality, it was generally illegal and pretty darn rare. Most folks in the Old West preferred to settle their disputes through less lethal means like negotiation, mediation, or even a good old-fashioned fistfight. You see, life on the frontier was tough enough without the constant threat of duels. Communities were more interested in cooperation and survival than engaging in deadly showdowns. And those who did resort to dueling often found themselves in trouble with the law, as many territories had strict regulations against such affairs. So, the next time you watch a Western where dueling is as common as cowpoke lingo, remember that real-life folks in the Old West were more inclined to talk it out than to draw and fire. The truth may not be as dramatic, but it sure is a lot more sensible. The rare instances of dueling in the Old West were often driven by personal grievances, pride, or misunderstandings rather than a widespread cultural practice. While some well-known figures like Wild Bill Hickok and Wild Bill Longley were involved in duels, these cases were exceptions rather than the rule. So when you think about the Old West, don't picture it as a constant duel fest. Instead, imagine a land where folks, tough as they were, preferred to save their ammunition for more pressing matters and kept the peace in ways that didn't involve a deadly face-off at high noon. All cowboys were white. The notion that all cowboys were white, American-born individuals. Ye see, this here stereotype is about as accurate as a snake oil salesman's promises. The real deal is that cowboys came in all colors and backgrounds, and many of them weren't your typical Hollywood John Wayne. In the Old West, you'd find cowboys of Mexican, African American, and indigenous descent right in the range alongside their white compatriots. They weren't just ranch hands, they were skilled cattlemen, wranglers, and trailblazers who played vital roles in the cattle ranching industry. These cowboys weren't just herding cattle, they were breaking down racial and ethnic barriers in a land where the color of your hat mattered a lot less than your skill in the saddle. So next time you picture a cowboy, remember they weren't all cut from the same spurs, and diversity was as much a part of the Old West as the open range itself. Tumbleweeds were common in the Old West. One that's as tumble-tastic as they come, the idea that tumbleweeds were as common as the sunrise over the prairie. Now, I hate to burst your bubble, but this here myth is about as accurate as a snake oil salesman's claims. You see, tumbleweeds, those iconic rolling balls of dried plant matter, aren't native to North America. No, they hitched a ride from Eurasia in the late 19th century, and their association with the Old West is mostly a Hollywood invention. Back in those days, folks weren't dodging tumbleweeds left and right like they do in the movies. Now, I won't deny that tumbleweeds exist in parts of the American West today, but they weren't the iconic landscape featured you might imagine from those old westerns. So, when you think about the Old West, picture the vast open plains, the rugged cowboys, and the dusty trails, but don't let tumbleweeds tumble your notions of reality. Everybody carried a six-shooter. The notion that everyone was strapping a six-shooter on their hip. Well, I hate to break it to you, but that their myth is as full of holes as a piece of Swiss cheese. The truth is, not everyone in the Old West was toting a firearm. You see, guns back in them days weren't as easy to come by as beans in a chuckwagon. Firearms could be mighty expensive, and not every cowpoke or townsperson could afford them. Plus, many towns had strict rules about carrying weapons within city limits, and the local sheriff was none too keen on folks breaking the law. So, while it's true that some folks did carry a six-shooter, it wasn't as common as you might think. The image of every Tom, Dick, and Harry walking around with a loaded gun was mostly a Hollywood invention. In the real Old West, folks were more likely to settle their disputes with words than with bullets, and that's a fact you can take to the bank. It's high time we rounded up these wild myths and put them out to pasture for good. These tales have been running amok for years, thanks to the likes of Hollywood and Western films. And sure, there might be a nugget of truth in some of them, but they've been stretched out like a lasso over a runaway bull. You see, the Old West was a darn sight more complex than what you see in the movies. Life on the frontier was as diverse as a patchwork quilt, and folks weren't just black-hatted villains or white-hatted heroes. They were as varied as the colors of a sunset over the prairie. Sure, there were shootouts, swinging saloon doors, and the occasional tumbleweed, but the reality was more about survival, cooperation, and the pursuit of a better life. These myths might have added some spice to the legends of the Old West, but they also left us with a whole heap of misunderstanding. So next time you watch a Western or hear one of these myths, remember that the real Old West was as rich and varied as the tapestry of a starlit desert night. It was a place where history and humanity were more complex, nuanced, and less dramatic than the legends suggest. And that's the truth, partners.